Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining me again this week. I'm actually really excited to dive into another topic that I really felt was important that we address. And for those of you who are new, this actually might be a very steep learning curve because we are specifically talking about a treatment skill or a tool that we commonly use in CBT therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and even more specifically, exposure and response prevention. And that is the use of Imaginals, or what we otherwise call scripts. And some people also use flooding. And we are going to talk about this because there are a couple of reasons. Number one, I have, for those of you who don't know, I have an online course called ERP School. And in ERP School, it's for people with OCD, and we talk about how to really get an ERP plan for yourself, right? It's not therapy. It's a course that I created for those who don't have access to therapy or are not yet ready to dive into therapy, where they can really learn and understand how to, how to understand the cycle of OCD, how to get themselves out of it, and gives you a bunch of skills that you can go and try. And very commonly, we have questions about how to use Imaginals and scripts, when to use them, how often to use them, when to stop using them, when they become compulsive, and so forth. In addition to that, as many of you may not know, I have 9 highly skilled licensed therapists who work for me in the state of California and Arizona, where we treat face-to-face clients. We're actually in Los Angeles. We treat patients with anxiety disorders. And I also noticed that during my supervision, when I'm with my staff, they have questions about how to use Imaginals and scripts with the specific clients. So instead of just teaching them and teaching my students, I thought this was another wonderful opportunity to help teach you as well how to use Imaginals and why some people misuse Imaginals or how they misuse it. I think even in the OCD community, there has been a little bit of a bad rap on using scripts and Imaginals. And I have found using scripts and Imaginals to be one of the most helpful tools for clients and give them really great success with their anxiety and uncertainty and their intrusive thoughts. And so here we are today. It is again a start of another very short series. This is just a 3-week series talking about different ways we can approach Imaginals and scripts and how you can use it to help manage your intrusive thoughts and how you can use it to reduce your compulsions. Right? So it is going to be 3 weeks, as I said. Today, we are starting off with the amazing Krista Reed. She's been on the show before, and she was actually the one who inspired this. After we did the last episode together, she said, I would love to talk more about Imaginals and scripts. And I was like, actually, I would too, and actually would love to get some different perspectives. So today we're talking with Krista Reed. Next week, we have the amazing Charla Nicely. You guys already know about Charla Nicely, and I'm so happy to have her very individual approach, which I think and I use all the time as well. And then finally, we have Dr. John Grayson coming in talking about acceptance with Imaginals and scripts. He does a lot of work with Imaginals and scripts using acceptance, and I wanted to make sure we kind of rounded it out with his perspective. So one thing I want you to think about as we move into this series or 3-part episode of the podcast is these are approaches that you should try and experiment with and take what you need, right? I have found that some scripts work really well with some clients and others don't work so well with other clients. I have found that some scripts do really well with one specific obsession and that doesn't do a lot of impact with another obsession that they may have. So I want you just to be curious and open and be ready to sort of learn and take what works for you, because I think all of these approaches are incredibly powerful. Again, in ERP School, we have a specific training on how to do 3 different types of scripts. One is a uncertainty script, one is a worst case scenario script, and the last is an acceptance script. So if you're really wanting to learn a very structured way of doing these, head on over to cbtschool.com and you can sign up for ERP School there. But I hope this sort of gets you familiar with it and helps really answer any questions that you may have. All right, so let's get over to the show. Here is Krista Reed. Welcome back, Krista Reed. I am so happy to have you back on the show.
Thank you. I am elated to be able to chat with you again. This is going to be great.
Yeah. And the cool thing is you are the inspiration for this series.
Which is so flattering.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. After our last episode, Krista and I were having a whole conversation and you were saying how much you love this topic. And I was like, light bulb, this is what we need to do. Because I think the beautiful piece of this is there are different ways in which you can do Imaginals. And I wanted to have some people come on and just share like how they're doing it. And you can compare and contrast and see what works for you. So that being said, tell us, number one, do you call it an Imaginal? Do you call it a script? Do you think they're the same thing or do you consider them different?
I do consider them differently because when I think about script, I mean, just the word script is it's writing. It's handwriting, in my opinion. I mean, scripture is spoken. That's something a little bit different, but scripting is writing. When I think of an Imaginal, that is your imagination. And I know that I already shared with you how much I love Imaginals because in reality, humans communicate through stories. And when we can, using our own imagination, create a story to combat something as challenging as OCD, what a powerful concept. And that's exactly why I just simply love Imaginals.
I can feel it and I do too. I think there's such an important part. There's such an important piece of ERP or OCD recovery or anxiety recovery where it fills in some gaps, right?
Yes,
Right.
because Imaginals, the whole point, as we know, it's to imagine the feared object or situation. It could evoke distress, anxiety, disgust. And yet, by us telling those stories, we're poking the bear of OCD. Yeah. We're getting to some of that nitty gritty. And of course, as we know that not every obsession we can have a real life or an in vivo exposure. We just simply can't because of the laws of science, or let's be real, like might be illegal. Might be illegal. But Imaginals are also nice for some people that maybe the real life exposure, maybe that's too intense and they kind of need a little bit of a warm up or a buy-in to be able to do the in vivo exposure. And so, yeah, Imaginals, man, I freaking love them. They're great.
They're the bomb. Okay.
They really are.
I would love, and you again, you inspired this. You had said, I love to walk your listeners through how to do them effectively. And I think I remember you saying, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you had seen some people do them very incorrectly, that you were very passionate because of the fact that some people weren't being trained well in this. Is that true or did I get that wrong?
No, you absolutely got it right. And so correct and incorrect, I think maybe that is opinion. I'll say it in my way. I don't do it that way. That's a preference. But this is an inception. We're not having our clients, we're not putting stories into our clients' minds. The OCD is putting the stories into our clients' minds. And if you already have a written out kind of an idea of a script of like fill in the blanks, you are working some kind of inception, in my opinion. You are saying that this is how your story is supposed to be. Well, that's
Mm,
so silly. I'm not going to tell you how your story is supposed to be. I don't know how your imagination works.
mm,
And when we think of, just imagination, there's so many different levels of imagination. Let's say, for instance, if I have somebody who comes into my office who is by trade a creative writer, that imaginal is probably going to be very descriptive, have a
mm,
lot of heavy adjectives. They're going to be able to have just the way it's going to be put together is going to be probably kind of like an art in itself, because this is
mhm,
kind of what that person does.
mhm.
If you have somebody who comes in and creativity is not something that is part of a personality trait, and then I have a written kind of like fill in the blank thing for them, it's not going to be authentic for their experience. They're going to potentially want to do what I, the therapist, might want them to do. It's
Yeah.
not for me to decide how creative or how deep that person is to go. They need to recognize within themselves, like, is this the most challenging? Is this the best way that you could actually describe that situation? And if that answer is yes, it's my job as a therapist to just say, okay.
And how would one know if it's the most descriptive they could be? Is it by just listening to what OCD has to say and letting OCD write the story, but not in a compulsive way? Like, share with me your thoughts.
I think that that's almost kind of like a double-edged sword,
Yeah.
is because that in itself can almost kind of go meta.
Yeah.
Like, how do I know that my story is intense enough? Well, on the surface, we can say, well, is it a hard thing to say?
Mhm.
And they might say yes. And then we can kind of work through. But if I'm saying, really kind of assessing, like, well, is it hard enough? Is it hard enough? And almost kind of, begging for them to provide some type of self
Yeah.
reassurance, they might get stuck in that cycle of, is this good enough? Is this good enough? Can it be even more challenging? Because another thing I love about Imaginals is because the limit doesn't exist, because the limit is just however far your imagination can take you. Let's say that I have a session with a client today and they're creating an Imaginal. And I'm just going to give like a totally random obsession. Maybe their obsession is, I'm afraid that I'm going to murder my husband in his sleep. Harm OCD type stuff, pretty common stuff that we do with Imaginals. And they do the Imaginal and they're able in session to work through it. It sounds like it was good. They were like in the session, what they provided, it was satisfactory to treatment. And then they come back and say, so I got bored with the story, which a lot of people think that that's a bad thing. That's actually a good thing, because that's letting you know that you're not in OCD's control of that feared response, that you're actually, doing the work. However, they might still have the obsession. And it's like, okay, so you were able to work through this, habituate, or, get bored of that. Now, let's create another imaginal with this obsession, because it's all imagination. There's
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah.
You can create as many as you possibly can or you possibly want to. So I'm actually going to give you a quote. So this is from, and he's a current professor right now at Harvard. He is a professor of cognitive and educational studies, which if you look this guy up, his name is Dr. Howard Gardner. I mean, his work is like brilliant, brilliant. But he has this fantastic quote that I think is it's just bomb when it comes to imaginal stuff. And his quote is, stories constitute the single most powerful weapon in a leader's arsenal. And how, like, think about that. Like, what a powerful statement
Like,
that is. Isn't that just a fantastic? Because we can hear that as the stories OCD tells us as being hard. Okay, cool story, bro. That is your weapon, OCD. But guess what? I'm smarter than you, and I brought a way bigger gun. And this gun is an Imaginal, and I'm going to go ahead and one up you. And if I come back that next week in my therapist's office and I'm able to get bored with that, I can make a bigger gun.
I love that. I love that. And it's true, isn't it? Right? Like it is about I often will say like that's a good story. Let me make it let me show you what I've got, right? It is
Yeah.
so powerful. Oh my gosh. Okay. So tell me how let's actually do it.
Okay.
Let's do it. Okay. So can you walk us through how you would
Mhm.
do an imaginal?
Okay, so this is actually something that I kind of created on my own, taken from just multiple trainings and ERP, learning about Imaginals. Because one of the things that I was realizing that a lot of clients were really struggling with is almost over preparing
Mhm.
for for just to do the Imaginal.
Mhm.
That sometimes they would write out the Imaginal and then we would kind of work through that. But what I was finding is sometimes clients were almost like too fixated on words, reading it right, being perfect, that they were almost kind of missing out on the fact that these are supposed to be movies in our mind.
Yeah.
I
They
want
intellectualize it.
exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So I created super simple format. I mean, we really don't have a lot of setup here. It's
Yeah.
basically kind of like along the lines of like the 5 W's. What is your obsession and what is your compulsion? Who is going to be in your story? So, who is involved? Where is your story taking place? When is your story taking place? And when is kind of already one of those that's already set, because I tell people it's like we can't do anything in the past. The past has already existed. You really need to be as present as possible.
Mhm.
But the thing is that you can also think, so for instance, if my obsession is I'm going to murder my husband in his sleep tonight, part of that might be tonight, but part of that might also be what is going to be my consequence? What is
Mhm.
that bad thing that's going to happen? Because
Yep.
maybe the bad thing isn't necessarily right now. Maybe that bad thing is going to be I'm not going to have a relationship with my children, and what if they have grandchildren?
Mhm.
Or what if I'm going to go to hell? And that might not necessarily exist in the here and now, but you're able to incorporate that in the story. So when is kind of an interesting thing, but again, never in the past, needs to start in the present and then kind of move forward. And then also I ask how. So how is where I want people to be as descriptive as possible. So for instance, if I say, and this is going to sound kind of gritty, you're fearful that you're going to murder your husband tonight. Be specific. How are you going to murder your husband? Because that's one of the things that OCD might want us to do. Is maybe it is just hard enough to say I'm going to murder my husband. Okay, but again, we're packing an arsenal here. Do you want to just say that? Because I can almost guarantee you OCD is already telling you
Yeah.
multiple different ways that it might happen. And which one of those seems like it might be the hardest? Well, the hardest one for me is smothering my husband with a pillow. Okay. So that's going to be it. And that's literally my setup. That's
Mhm.
literally my setup is I say that. So I have all that as a setup and then I say, okay, so at the very end, you are going to say this line. And all of this happened because I did not do the compulsion. So if I were going along with the story of I murdered my husband, suffocated him with a pillow, and in my mind, the worst thing to happen is I don't have a relationship with my kids and grandchildren. That would be, and the compulsion might be to pray. I'll just throw that out. I don't know. The last line might be, and now I don't have a relationship with my children or grandchildren, all because I decided to not pray when the thought of murdering my husband came up in my mind.
Mm.
So that is the entire setup. And then I have my clients get their phone out and push record. They don't have to do a video, just an audio is perfectly fine. I know some therapists that'll do it just once, but I actually do it over and over again. So sometimes it could be a 5 minute recording, it could be a 20-minute recording, it could be a 40-minute recording. And the reason for that being is if we stop just after one, we might be creating accommodation for that client because I want my clients to be in that experience. That first time they tell that story after that very brief setup, they're still kind of piecing together the story.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's really not until about the third or
Yeah.
fourth time that they've repeated that exact same story that they're really in it.
Yeah.
So I am just there. And every time they finish, because I'll know they finished because they say that, and this happened all because da 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 da. And then I say, okay, what's your number? And that means what's your suds? And they tell me their suds. I might make like a little bit, very, very minimal recommendations. Like for instance, if they say, and I murdered my husband, I say, okay, so this time I want you to tell me how you murdered your husband and again. And then they say the exact same story, closing their eyes all over again, this time adding in the little bit that I asked for. And we do that over and over and over again until we reach 50% habituation. Then they stop recording. That is what they use throughout the week as their homework. And you can add it in so many different ways. So, again, keeping along with this obsession of, I'm afraid I'm going to kill my husband tonight. I want you to listen to that with just one, as you probably have heard this as well, just one AirPod in, earbud, whatever. Keep your other ear outside to the world. This is kind of, its way to talk back to OCD, something along the lines of that. I want you to do that while you're getting ready for bed. Because if the fear exists at night and your compulsions exist at night, I want you to listen to that story before you go to bed. So it's already on your mind. You're already in it. You're already poking the bear of OCD. It's like, okay, so OCD, you're going to tell me I'm going to kill my husband tonight? Well, I'm going to hear a story about me killing my husband tonight. And guess what? The bad thing's going to happen over and over and over again. It's such a powerful, powerful, powerful thing. And
I love
because
it.
it's recorded, you can literally listen to it in your car. You can listen to it on a plane. You can listen to it in a waiting room. And there's no limit.
It's funny because you probably, for those of you who are on social media, there was this really big trend not long ago where they're like, what they think I'm listening to versus what I'm actually listening to. And they have this audio of like, and then she stabbed her with the knife. And I'm like, it's exactly that. Like everyone thinks you're just listening to Britney Spears, but you're listening to her exposure. And it's so effective, right? It's so,
So
so
effective.
effective. So I love this. Okay, so let's do it again because I want this to be as powerful as possible. Okay, so you did a harm exposure. In other
Mhm.
episodes, we've done a relationship one, we've done a pedophile one. Let's pick another one. Like, do you have any ideas? What would you
I
like?
was
What
thinking
about?
like velocity.
I was just gonna say, what about scrupulosity?
Yeah, yeah. That one is such a common one for Imaginals. We hear it very frequently of, I'm going to go to hell,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm not going to be, like, even thinking about different other religions, like maybe I'm not going to be reincarnated into something that has meaning,
Yep.
or it's going to be a bad
Yep.
thing. Maybe I'm insulting my ancestors, or just kind of just
Yep.
whatever that might be. So let's say just the obsession is, if I already mentioned praying, maybe if I don't read the Bible correctly, I'm going to go to hell. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know.
Yep.
Something along the lines of that. And if that's their obsession, chances are they're probably somebody that maybe they have a time where they're reading the Bible, or maybe that we have to add in an vivo where they're going to be reading or something like that. So
Right.
a setup could potentially be, all right, so what is your obsession? I'm afraid that anytime I read my Bible, I'm not reading it correctly and I'm going to go to hell. So, what is your compulsion? Well, my compulsion is I read it over and over and over again, and I reassure myself that I understand it. I'm reading it correctly. Who's going to be in your story? And this one you might hear just, oh, it's just me. Really,
Mhm.
OCD doesn't necessarily care too much if anybody else is in this story. Okay. Where are you? I'm in my living room. It's nighttime. That's when I read my Bible. Okay. And when is this taking place? Oh, we can do it tonight. Let's say it's tonight. And then when interestingly enough, when you have stuff that's going to go to hell, that kind of means, well, how are you getting to hell to begin with?
Mm.
Because that's not just something that can happen. So sometimes in these imaginals, the person has to die in order
Right.
to get there. Or or they have to create some type of like fantastical way of them getting to hell. So I actually had a situation, this was several years ago, where the person was like, well, death doesn't scare me, but going to hell scares me. And what really scares me is the thought of, because, in some cultures and some religions, it's believed that there are demons like living amongst us and so forth. And it's really scary to think about, what if a demon approaches me and takes me immediately to hell?
Yeah.
And I don't get to say goodbye to my family doesn't know, and just kind of even like that thought. And so we were able to incorporate something very similar to that. So that could be just to kind of make up an imaginal on the spot. Could be, so I'm reading my Bible, I'm in my living room, and the thought pops up in my brain of, did you read that last verse correctly? And I decide to just move on and not worry about reading my Bible correctly. Well, then all of a sudden I get a knock at the door, and there's these strange men that I've never seen in my life. And they tell me that they're all demons, and that because I didn't review the Bible correctly, I'm going to go to hell. And I would go on and probably
Mhm.
describe a little bit more about like my family not missing me. I don't get to see my kids grow up. I don't get to experience life, the travel and the stuff that's really important to me, incorporate some of those values of like, I don't get to live my value based life. And then at the very end, and I was summoned and taken to hell by demons, all because I had the thought of reading my Bible correctly and I decided not to.
Mhm. I love it. And I love what I will point out. I think you use the same model as me, is that we use a lot of I statements, like I did this and I did that and then this happened and then I died, or I so forth. Use like the other thing that we do is always have it in present tense, like then this,
Mhm.
instead of going and then this happens and then that happens, you're saying it as if it's happening.
Yeah.
Right.
Because
Love.
you want it to feel real to the
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
And in all honesty, and I wonder what your experience has been. So I find some of the most difficult people to do imaginals with are children,
Hmm.
even though you would think, oh, they're so imaginative anyways. One of the biggest things I really have to remind kids is, I want you to be like literally imagining yourself in that moment, because sometimes again, I see this with kids, more adults, but I think it's just depends on context and perspective. We'll say, well, I know that I'm in my living room, or I know that I'm in your office. So this isn't actually happening to me in this moment. And so you kind of almost have to like really like work them up and figure out, well, what's the barrier here? Like, what are you resisting?
That's a good question. So I would say 10 to 20% of clients of mine will report, I don't feel anything. What is your I'll do a Q&A at the end of this series with common questions, but I'm curious to know what your response is to a client who, reads like, I kill my baby, or I hurt my mom, or I go to hell, or I cheat on my husband, or whatever it is, but it doesn't land. What is your thoughts on what to do then?
A couple things pop up. One, it makes me wonder what mental compulsions they're doing. And then it also makes me wonder, are we going in the right direction with the story? Because again, like I mentioned before, if a client comes back and they've habituated to one thing, but they're still having the obsession, well, guess what? We're just telling stories.
Yeah.
And because the OCD narrative is typically not just like laser focused. I mean, it can be laser focused, but usually it has branches. You can kind of pick and choose.
Right.
Like, I'm going to go ahead and guarantee that person who is terrified of killing their husband, and sure, they're not going to see their grandchildren and children. I'm going to go ahead and waver that there's probably other things that they're afraid of missing.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. And that's what I find too, is maybe we haven't gotten to the actual consequence that bothers them,
Yeah.
right? I know for myself, when I've written these for myself, we tend to like fall into normal traps of subtypes, like the fear of that you'll harm somebody or so forth. But often clients will reveal like, I'm actually not so afraid that I'll harm somebody. I'm really afraid of what my colleagues and family would think of me if I did. And so we have to include that. Or I'm afraid of having, I'm afraid of having to make the call to my mom if I did the one thing. Or I think that that's a really
Yeah.
important piece to it, is to be really double down on the consequence. Do you agree, or is that not a
Oh,
big
I
piece to you?
agree 100%. You got to figure out, what is that core fear? What are you
Mm,
really, really trying to avoid
mm,
with harming somebody? Is it the consequences that might happen afterwards? Is it the feeling of potentially snapping or losing control? Or is it just knowing that you just flat out took the life of somebody and that
yeah,
was something that you were capable of? I mean, there's so many different themes, and looking at kind of like, what is that feared self? Like, what does that look like? And maybe we didn't hit it last time.
yeah,
And I know this is going to sound silly, and I tell my clients this every once in a while, is I'm not a mind reader.
right.
Like, what I'm asking you, like, is that the most challenging you can go? And you're telling me yes, I'm going to trust you.
Yeah, yeah,
And I tell them, I say, if you are not pushing yourself in therapy to the point to where you can grow, I'm still going to go to bed home and like sleep tonight, like just fine. But I want you to also go home and go to bed and sleep just fine.
right.
But if you are not pushing yourself, because we know sleep gets affected super bad, not just sleep, but other areas, you're probably going to struggle. And you might even come back next week with a little bit more guilt or even some shame. And I
Mm,
don't want anybody to have that.
right,
I
right,
want, I want people to win. I want
right.
people to do well in this.
Yeah.
I know this stuff is scary, but I'm gonna quote somebody. You might know her. Her name is Kimberly Quinlan. She says it's a beautiful day to do hard things. I like to quote her in my practice every once in a
I've
while.
heard of her. I've heard I've heard
Big
things.
fan.
Yes, I agree. I agree with this. And I think it's so the way you explain it is so beautiful, because and it's logical the way you're explaining it too, right? It makes sense.
Mm,
It makes sense. Okay, so I have one more question for you.
okay.
Okay. So recently I was doing some Imaginals with a client, and they were very embarrassed about the content of their thoughts, and ashamed and guilty and horrified by their thoughts. And I could see that they were having a hard time. So I kind of gave them a little inch and I went first. I was like, all right, so I'm going to make an assumption about what yours is just to break the ice. And
Mhm.
they were like, oh, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And there was a relief on their face in that I had covered the bases. And we did all of the Imaginal and we recorded it and it was all set. And then at the end, I said, is there anything that we didn't include? And they reported, yeah, my OCD actually uses much more graphic words than what you use. Like, and I think that what was so interesting to me in that moment was, okay, I did them the favor by starting the conversation, but I think they felt that that's as far as we could go. How far do you go?
As far as we need.
But
Um,
tell me what that
I
means.
Gosh, like I mentioned before, like the limit does not exist, and I mean
Yes.
the limit does not exist.
Yes.
Like, I want you to be like a this is gonna sound so silly. I want you to be like a young Stephen King before he wrote his first novel, and push it,
Yes.
push it, and then go there. And guess what? If that novel just doesn't quite hit it, write another one,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then another one. And let's see how far you can go. Because OCD is essentially a disorder of the imagination. And you
Yeah.
get to take back your imagination by creating the stories that OCD is telling us and twisting it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, what an amazing and powerful thing to be able to do. And I'm sure you're the same, that you know that there's a lot of specialists that don't believe in imaginals, don't like imaginals, especially when it comes to issues along like with pedophilia, OCD.
Mhm.
And I think we also need to not remind our clients, because that would be reassurance, but to tell these specialists, we're not putting anything into our clients' heads that aren't there to begin with.
Yep.
Just
Yep.
like you said, if your client is thinking like real sick, nasty, gore, whatever, guess what? We're gonna be going there.
Yep. And
Are
that's
you are you cutting off heads of babies in your head? Well, we're gonna be talking about stories where you're cutting off heads of babies.
yeah.
If that's what's going on, we're gonna go there.
Yeah. And what's really interesting, and this was the example, is we were talking about genitals, right? And sexual organs and so forth. And we're using the politically correct term for them in the Imaginal. Great. Such a great exposure, right? Like,
Mhm.
vagina and penis, great. Until again, they were like, yeah, but my OCD uses much more graphic words for them. I'm like, well, we need to include those words,
Yeah.
right? Like your Imaginals, would you agree your Imaginals don't need to be PC?
Oh, I hope my clients watch this. Matter of fact, I'm gonna send this to them. Just to be like, "No, no. Krista's Imaginals with her clients." Well, not my Imaginals, Imaginals that are with my clients. Whew!
Yeah.
There are sometimes I want like, I'm saying bye to my client, I'm like, "I think I need a shower. That was
But that's why I love, and this is again when people say they don't like Imaginals or they think that it's not a good practice. I feel like you said, if OCD is going to come up with it, it gives an opportunity to empower them to get ahead of the game, to go there before it gets there so that you can go, okay, I can handle it. There's nothing.
Yeah,
I would often say to my clients, let's go as far as we can go, as far as you can go, so that you know that there's nothing there's nothing it can come up with that you can't handle.
yeah. I think that where it gets even more complex is when we're hitting some of the taboo stuff, not only like pedophilia, but something like right now that I'm seeing a lot more of in my office is stuff relating to like cancel culture.
Mhm.
This fear that, what if I don't use somebody's pronouns correctly?
Yeah.
What if I accidentally say an inappropriate racial slur?
Yes.
And I will ask in session, and and I'll be super real. It's hard for me to hear this
Yeah.
stuff because this goes outside of my values.
Yeah.
And of course it goes outside of their values. OCD knows that. That's
Yeah.
why it's messing with them.
Mhm.
And I'll say, okay, so what is the racial slur? And my clients are always like, you really want me to say it? And I said, we're going to say it in the imaginal. And
Yeah.
I realized how hard that is to stomach for therapists. But in my brain, the narrative that OCD is pushing, whether it is what society views as OCD or taboo OCD, it doesn't matter. We still have to get it out. It is still hard for that client. If it's hard for that client to think of an imaginal or a racial slur, it is almost the exact same amount of distress for somebody maybe with an imaginal that I'm afraid I'm getting food poisoning.
Yeah.
We as
Yeah. Yeah.
clinicians, just because we're very caring and loving people, sometimes we can unintentionally put a hierarchy of distress upon our clients. Like, okay, so I can do this imaginal because this falls with my values, but I don't know if I
Yeah.
can do this imaginal because pedophilia is something that's hard for me to
Right.
do, and I don't want to put my client through that. Well, guess what? Your client is already being put through
That's
that, whether
right.
you like it or not. It's called OCD.
Right. And suppressing it makes it come on stronger anyway. So it's like
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Love that. And I think that the beauty of that is there is a respectful, value-based way of doing this work, but still getting ahead of OCD. Is that sort of what you're
Mhm.
saying?
Absolutely.
Mhm. Mhm.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
OCD tries to mess with us and think that, what if you could be this person? Well, if, like I mentioned before, if a story is like a weapon, well, I'm going to tell a story to attack OCD
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Beautiful.
it's already doing it to me.
Yeah. Tell us where people can hear about more from you, get your resources, because this is such great stuff.
Well, Thank you. Thank you. I'd say probably the best way to find me and my silly videos would be on my Instagram at anxiously balanced.
Amazing. And your private practice?
Yes, my private practice is A Peaceful Balance in Wichita, Kansas, and the website is apbwichita.com.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for you for inspiring this whole series and for also being here as a big piece of the puzzle.
Thank you. I'm grateful for you that you don't mind me just like this. I'm grateful for you for letting me talk, even though clearly I'm not very good at it right now. You're amazing.
No, you're amazing. Thank you. Really, these are hard topics. And just the fact that you can talk about it with such respect and grace and compassion and education and experience is gold. Gold, gold,
Thank
gold.
you.
Yeah.
At
Thank
the
you.
end of the day, I really truly want people to get better. And I know you truly want people to get better. And isn't that just the goal?
Yeah. Yeah. It's beautiful. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.